you picked for this? Because we hate you. No. Because you hate yourself. No, I'm kidding. You were hand-selected because you were believed to be capable. Okay, the thoracic cavity. So I'm just not talking about anatomy, having had all that, right? You done with anatomy? You feel good about anatomy? Don't you want to keep doing that? So anything upper, you know, is you covered in HEMT, and now you're lower. So we're just right in here, and the first thing I want to do is move air in before we talk about all the other things. So how do you get? So that's the thing: moving air in, moving air out. So you're trying to get oxygen in. You're getting rid of carbon dioxide, and so you have to have these exchanges. And this is an interface that is the blood to atmospheric air interface, which is really very interesting. So it's really kind of an external environment. You have to get air in there. So the atmospheric pressure is 760 milligrams of mercury at sea level, and for the life of me, I still don't understand what millimeters of mercury means. It is what the pressure exerted by a column of mercury, 760 millimeters high. Clear? Clear as mud. But whatever it is, we have decided that's how we measure it. That means something. Mercury was such a big thing. We used to use it in thermometers. You break it and play with it, and you found out that it's not good to do that. It's very interesting. So mercury was used a lot. Anyway, that's at sea level, so we're about 1,300 feet above sea level here. If you're from Oklahoma, no one ever talks about that. But if you go to Colorado, people are, or Utah, they're always pointing out peaks and saying that's a 12.5 and that's a 10.8, and you know, you hear that a lot. We don't talk about that much here. But we're at about 1,300. And so I was just kind of looking up. For every 1,000 feet above sea level, there's about a 1 inch of mercury change, which is about 25 millimeters of mercury change. So anyway, you don't have to know that. But here in Oklahoma, we are at about 720 atmospheric pressure. But we only in these courses in physiology talk about it as 760. So the numbers, of course, would be relative to the atmospheric pressure you were in. So there are 3 really areas of pressure: exterior, ambient pressure, which is sea level 760; intrapulmonary, which is across the alveolar space or inside the lungs. And so that's changing with the volume, because pressure and volume are related. And then the intrapleural pressure, which is between the two pleurae of the thoracic cavity, so that visceral and parietal pleura. And there's a little space there, and it has serous, so the fluid there, and those membranes can slide across each other, but they don't separate very easily. So like 2 slides, microscope slides with water on, you know, you can pull them apart like this. Sometimes you do that in your dishes. You put 2 glasses away that are wet or something like that. They're hard to pull apart, and you can slide things apart, and that's exactly how that works. And so that is always subatmospheric at about -4 millimeters of mercury, and that is extremely important to lung function. So we have this very airy space, and we can't let it collapse. It has to stay not collapsed. What's the word I'm trying to say? Aerated. And so we can keep the lungs kind of sucked up to that thoracic wall and make everything go. So 3 important factors hold the lung tissue to the thorax wall so that you don't have collapse. One is there's the surface tension of pleural fluids. That little intrapleural fluid has the surface tension. So you hear surface tension a lot, but it means really it's an adherence factor. Tension is this adherence you can get to these 2 membranes that holds those membranes together and helps hold the lungs to the thorax wall. There's a positive pressure in the lungs. So remember that little space, that intrapleural space interpleural space is negative pressure or subatmospheric. And the lungs are always just near atmospheric pressure, a little bit less at times to draw air in, but always more positive than that. And then the atmospheric pressure from the outside, those same 3 pressures, will exert some pressure upon the thorax wall. And so you have this little layer of subatmospheric pressure, really kind of low pressure, and that is sandwiched between two positive pressures, and it really helps elevate or hold those lungs up against the thorax wall, because you need that so that you can draw air in. So the posture of the thoracic cage is super important in breathing. And you know that because you've used all your accessory muscles and intra-abdominal pressure and rearing back to try to get blood into your lungs. Don't do that. Well, actually, you can do that. And then air into your lungs. Now, there are factors also. There is recoil, or this tendency of that same lung tissue, which is very stretchy, to recoil back to its smallest space. And so those are factors kind of opposing that elevation of the lungs to the thorax wall. And that's that recoil tendency. The elastic nature, you know that about something elastic, it always wants to get to its smallest size. And so you have to battle against that. That's just the natural physics of the tissue. And then the alveolar surface tension. So you get down all the way through that respiratory tree, down to little bronchioles, down to terminal bronchiole, down to the respiratory bronchioles, which have all the sacs of alveoli, and all those. So that little sphere itself tends to want to collapse. It wants to seek its smallest space, like a balloon would want to collapse into itself. And we want to keep those open and uncollapsed, and there's a surface tension within the alveolus. So if there were just water in there, water has a high surface tension, they would collapse. So we use fluid in there as well to reduce that surface tension and keep them juicy and full and ready. So there's lots of stuff trying to collapse those lungs, but of course we have all these ways of preventing that. We'll talk a bit more about surfactant, but that's part of the fluid, part of the component of the fluid in that alveolar space, and it's the type 2 alveolar cells that secrete that. Now, I'm doing that thing where I can't catch my breath, always about 10 minutes into lecture. Did you do the type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells and the kind of tissue along the way in anatomy?
No.
You didn't do that, so we need that here. Okay, well, I will add that. I will add that because you need that. But for the most part, as you go along that chute, I wish I had a slide about that easy way. Probably do as we go on. Let's go along and see what I've got, and then I'll fill it in. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is how do we keep the lungs expanded and adherent to the thorax wall? I can't overemphasize how important that is. That little bit of negative pressure is so important that if it changes, lungs can collapse. There's a couple of areas of lung collapse. There are terms to describe that, and you'll look at that through pathophysiology specifically. But atelectasis and how they're kind of defined in physiology and how you really use those terms in medicine are just a wee bit different. But atelectasis would sort of mean any kind of lung collapse, and we think of that as sort of an internal issue. And so when you run across it very commonly in your practice is people who aren't inflating their lung tissue well. So with some sort of disease state, post-operative atelectasis is a big, a common complication. So you always want your patients to keep respirating, you know? And you know this too, when you're out and walking, you're doing whatever, if you just make your thorax big and continue to move as much air as you can, you create respiratory tissue health. So atelectasis is sort of lung collapse from an interior sort of thing. Pneumothorax would be if you introduce air from the outside into the thorax and you equilibrate those pressures in that intrapleural space and the lung can collapse. And so this is typically you see stabbing or gunshot, and there are some spontaneous pneumothorax which can occur as well. And you'll look at those disease states, but the important thing is that this all stays intact and works like it's supposed to, and these tissues can slide and stay in the thorax wall. And that's so you can breathe. Let's go to that. Cue the slide. All right. Oh, you're just so excited about Boyle's Law. I know, we're here. Pressure of a gas it varies inversely with its volume. So as pressure goes up, volume goes down, and vice versa. So the reason is they're inversely proportional to each other. So you're gonna have so many of these in your life. As one goes up, the other goes down, you know, we talked about. Remember half, remember one of them really well, you can always deduce the next one if you tend to get confused about ups and downs. But here's the thing, gas, like a fluid, seeks to equilibrate in a container. And a gas is different than a liquid, that it will always fill the container from all sides, whereas you know the liquid cells. So if there's a large volume, that gas will fill it, meaning those molecules are separated somewhat, and so that pressure is low. Volume is high and pressure is low. If you compress that space, decreasing volume, you compress and put those molecules closer together, so the pressure is higher. It creates higher pressure. So they're inversely proportional. And so there's a little V and a P, and if these kind of curves mean stuff to you, that's awesome. Sometimes they mean a lot to people. But you always want to, when you look at a table, and when you see these on, you know, like board exams and stuff like that, I mean, you just read the axes first so you know where you are. And then you can kind of figure out that it's not completely linear. There is this sort of curved nature of it. So anyway, the body makes use of this law. So it was around way before Dr. Boyle. And so what we can do then is if we increase the volume of the thoracic cage in all directions, up and down, laterally, front and back, if you increase the volume, what does that do to pressure naturally? You decrease the pressure naturally. So if we increase the volume of the thoracic cage, we reduce the pressure just a wee bit below what atmospheric pressure is. Only like 1 millimeter of mercury. It doesn't take much. But what that does is it means the atmospheric pressure is a little higher. We've lowered pressure here in the thoracic cavity by increasing the volume. And air will flow along its pressure gradient. And that just means from a high to a low, from a high pressure to a lower pressure. It's very natural. It would passively flow in. So increase the thoracic volume, lower the interior pressure, air will naturally flow in. But it is an active process. The movement of the air is passive, but increasing the volume is active, so we use the muscles to do that. And then similarly, if we just contract, or not even contract the muscles, what did I just say? We contract muscles to create volume. And if we just relax those muscles, you'll compress that space. When you compress the volume, reduce the volume, what happens to pressure? You're reducing volume, so pressure goes the other way. And then it's higher pressure inside here than it is out there. And so air will passively escape to the exterior. So see, we just make use of that natural fact to breathe. And so you can just remember one of them, the other one will work. So here's one of these that has all the sequence of events on it. And rather than reading all of them, I'm starting to place a lot of these kind of things in your slides so that you have something to refer to later. Because something will make sense to somebody. You know, it doesn't mean you have to know all of them, so there's more than one example here. But this is about expanding the thoracic cage. And so the intercostal muscles will contract, which draws together and elevates the ribs. It draws ribs together and up. So you haven't done muscle, you've done muscles, but not muscle function. True? Okay. So the diaphragm and intercostals are going to be the muscles of inspiration or inhalation. So you elevate these ribs and you draw them up and you expand the rib cage this way. But the greatest, the muscle that has the biggest contribution to changing the volume of the thoracic cage is the diaphragm. And it will move inferiorly and flatten out, and you really can create a lot of space that way. And so you're creating space in all the directions. Can you do this? All the directions. Okay, that helped me. I didn't need to help you. Okay, and so if you look at it like this, superior view, that you get movement in all directions. The point is, muscle contraction increases thoracic cage volume, reducing the pressure, air will naturally come in. Because we want that. Why do we want the air to come in? Come on, you know it. What? Yes, what's the thing you're looking for? Why? Oh, damn. Remember the mitochondria? Oh, God, I hate when she does that. Okay, so you bring in glucose, and you clip it apart, and you end up with all this molecular rearrangement, and you're kicking off electrons all along the way. Electrons are very high energy, and they get captured by electron carriers. And in the mitochondrial membrane, there's this relay of electrons, and every time you relay and change electrons between carriers, a little bit of energy is liberated, and you harness that energy to make ATP, to add the P to ADP. So it's the electrons which are high energy. Now they've been utilized all along the membrane, and energy has been sucked out of them to make about 3-ish ATP along that chain. But you made a lot of electron pairs, so you can end up with in the 30s for glucose. But anyway, you sucked up all the energy just about out of these electrons. They are beat down. It's the end of the day, PA, electrons. And where do they go? What's the thing that will take the lousiest, low energy electrons on Earth?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. It's so hungry. That's why we're always talking about antioxidants. Because oxygen is itself it's so hungry for electrons, it can actually steal electrons from molecules we would like to not have anything happen to. So we have all these antioxidant molecules which will take the bullet, will dominate your electrons and get them kind of off track, but it's exciting for all of us, right? Antioxidant, because oxygen oxidizes and steals and likes electrons. Take what it can get. But what happens is that works during oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative, oxygen meaning oxygen is needed. Phosphorylation is the addition of a phosphate onto that ADP to make ATP. Okay, that's because the cell does that to make ATP to run all the things in the cell. So you have lungs to bring in the oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation to make ATP. So we have this whole entire course now just because your cells need oxygen, and we have to deliver it there. So this is what we're trying to get in. Now when we exhale, what are we trying to get rid of largely? CO2. Where did that come from? Where did it come from? Come on, I'm going to keep dancing until someone comes up. What did you break down to liberate all those electrons?
Glucose.
Yes! Glucose. You broke apart glucose, liberated all of that glucose as the gas, carbon dioxide. Isn't that crazy? You burned fuel. This is really what your car does. It's taking hydrocarbon chains, way longer than glucose is only 6. It's taking these long hydrocarbon chains and burning it, liberating oxygen for fuel to burn, right? So, and you have emissions. It's not clean, so the emissions aren't clearly CO2. So it's because of oxidative phosphorylation that you breathe. Oh, God, is that not exciting? I mean, really though, isn't that adorable? You're a slave to your mitochondria. That's all we are. That's all you think of me as. Okay, so let's breathe out. And kids, I'm on like slide 3, so just, hang on, it's fun. And so really what happens is the inspiratory muscles will just relax. And they worked to draw up and create space, and then when they just relax, they naturally, stuff will come back down. The ribs will kind of separate back, lower down, move inferiorly. The diaphragm moves up. I'm okay. The diaphragm moves, it lowers, and everything kind of collapses back down. And that causes compression of that space. if when the volume compresses or becomes lower, what does that do to the pressure? Increases it. It's only another 1 millimeter of mercury change, but that will be higher than atmospheric pressure and air will leave. Now, there are also lots of accessory muscles that when we need, I'm just talking about kind of tidal eupnea or normal breathing, just in and out. And you can add muscles to that, the neck, the abdominals, and to increase the ability to inspire or forcibly expire with additional muscles. So now air can go out. Then you do it again. And then here's just another picture with like numbers on it, because like numbers on it. Okay, so you see this transpulmonary pressure. It changes, it deviates, but it always remains subatomic. And that was really important about lung function. So there's just another picture for you to take in. We inspire, increase the volume, expire, decrease the volume, and air flows along its pressure gradient. Okay, looky, here's an equation. So that all sounds great. You know it's going to get a lot more complicated than that, right? So you have things which are really going to oppose airway movement, and then this becomes all the things that help the lungs dysfunction the way they can, for the most part. So how do we, then when air isn't moving well, we're not getting the good ventilation that we need so that we can supply oxygen. What are the things that act against or oppose that? And one of the big ones is resistance, airway resistance. And you'll hear that quite a bit. It's the opposition to airflow. And what it is, so there's that V with the dot over it, that means airflow. It's in milliliters per minute, so that's about movement. And it is equal to the change in pressure divided by the resistance of the airways. Oh, so airway resistance acts against pressure. That's all I'm saying. That's all that equation is saying. So you'll have to calculate every time you give someone oxygen, you'll have to calculate for this, so it's important to learn that. Just kidding. You slap 2 liters on them, it's fine. There's pulmonologists for that, and then you can work with them. So why is there resistance in the airway? Because the diameter of the tube is a big thing. That makes sense. And so flow through any tube, and this is true through all the tubes, and we have tons of tubes. We are, our bodies. But movement can be very laminar or linear along that, unobstructed, or it can be turbulent. You know, we create turbulence on purpose in the nasopharynx and in the nasal cavity. We create turbulence to slow down air, to swirl, make it swirl, help help precipitate out all the precipitates and stuff, particles, and get them to stick to hairs and to mucus and all that, to humidify. And then we would like for the air to just move pretty well. But every time you hit a junction, there's going to be a little turbulence. That slows down airway. That makes it more resistant. A lot of junctions as you're going on through that respiratory tree, from trachea to bronchi to all those little bitty tubes. And then the viscosity of the gas, and that's not a huge thing because we are in a pretty constant composition of gas. But if for some reason gas changes, you know, like if you're in a smoky environment and stuff like that, certainly it's harder to breathe. And viscosity of gas is increased when it's humid like this. And so your respiratory patients will always have a little bit harder time when it's, well, humid or dry, depending on the conditions. So anyway, airway resistance opposes airflow. So some of the big things that affect airway resistance, obstruction is one. Is there something in the way? Did you stick a marble up your nose? Did you ever? Why do kids want to stick stuff up their nose? I think that's just, you know, I didn't have that. Unfortunately, my daughter didn't. But you know, there are kids that like to stick stuff up their nose. I guess that's weird for some things.
All the time.
You were a nose sticker?
No, I just have seen it in my practice.
Oh, yeah,
and my husband comes home, he works, he already tells me, everyone's like, yeah, I had to remove it, and I'm like,
What is that?
kids just do it.
I know. I mean, I suppose that's better than an anal fixation. I'm not sure.
Which happens all the
Which
time as
also
well.
happens all the time.
Oh,
I don't know. You
It
feel
really
more
does.
anally fixated as you age.
stuff gets stuck up there.
That's beside the point. But obstruction can also then be, just mucus. It can be an inflammatory process going on. A lot of, anything like that will block airway movement. And so how much is involved, and of course goes to pulmonary dysfunction. But a couple of the things that really are affecting at all times bronchial diameter is bronchoconstriction or bronchodilation, and those things are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is that which we really have no control over, and it's divided into two categories, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they innervate everything and have largely opposing activities. So the parasympathetic control is normal, quiet activity, and sympathetic control is for the stress that you're under. And so you can react. So in smooth, look under, this is easier to, I think, look at bronchodilation. When you let those smooth muscles, so there are circular smooth muscles along that respiratory tree, down until you get really close to the alveoli. And those circular muscles can relax, which causes bronchodilation, and that would open the airway, and that's under sympathetic control. And you want that when you're trying to deal with stress, so that you can inhale and you can exchange gases fully and to accommodate your oxygen needs, and to also get rid of then the carbon dioxide. And so that is just a normal course of airway constriction that gets dealt with. And so there are disease processes, which then when you see increased bronchoconstriction, reactive airways disease, asthma, airways are very reactive and tend to constrict. And then it doesn't matter how much work you do or how much you change pressure or volume, if that airway is constricted, you don't ventilate that section distal to the constriction. Oh God, lung compliance. It's starting to get real. Okay, and really, lung compliance. So airway resistance is how do we block air coming in? Compliance is, how you get air in is because this is a very stretchy deal, these lungs. Really, the lung is almost entirely airspace. The alveolar walls are very thin, just simple epithelium. And so lots of air can be in there. And the surrounding interstitial space needs to be really stretchy and elastic and compliant. And the more compliant it is, you can distend or stretch this space. And if we stretch and create more volume, you do what? You decrease pressure and you can allow air in. So compliance really goes to ventilation. And the greater the stretchiness, the greater the compliance, the better air can be moved. And so healthy lung tissue is compliant. And then there is another beloved little equation, and that little C is for compliance of lung tissue. And you just are seeing this volume and pressure again. Let's see, what is that? This is a lung compliance curve. And I don't want you to freak out about it. Okay, so it's a graph. So first I'm going to look at volume, and this is really transpulmonary pressure, or pressure across the lung. And so the red line there is inspiration. And so compliance, you have to overcome the stretch, and once you get across that inertia, there's a great ability or compliance of that lung tissue until you really hit peak compliance where alveoli would burst if they got more compliant. So then we compress the lungs and push the air out on that upper part of the curve. Expiration is purple or blue. And so inspiration, expiration. You overcome the compliance, gets very compliant, then you stop and you go back down. Stretchy, good stretchy tissue. And this gap in between the two sides of that picture or curve is hysteresis, the gap between the two. And sometimes in lung dysfunction, that term may come up. And the closer those things are together, the less compliant the lungs are. And that goes to pulmonary dysfunction or lack of ventilation. for whatever cause. And I think, I'm not gonna say that. And, okay, so here's a little picture of the airway tree here. Okay, so you see trachea, you know these guys, you did all this anatomy-wise, right? So they split off, split into a variety of bronchioles, or then the smallest. The smallest subdivision of the bronchi would be a bronchiole. It's about 1 millimeter in diameter. Do you like thinking about stuff like that? Because you have a cartoon in your head maybe of how you think things look, and then when you apply a real number to it and think it's a millimeter, that's so small. I mean, I think I'm thinking of like 6 big sacks in there or something. There are 300 million alveoli. So you branch a lot. So you can imagine airway resistance, having to overcome all that. And then there's muscle in there, in the upper bronchioles. So you have this conducting zone. So let me just kind of break this down because I think I thought you knew this stuff, but that's cool, no big deal. So look here, conducting zone and respiratory zone. So there's just some plumbing to get air through where air exchange does not occur, respiration does not occur. There's some tubing, some tooling to get through. So the conducting zone is where air is in the lungs moving through the trachea and the bronchi, and bronchi, and bronchi, and bronchiole, and bronchiole, and bronchiole all the way down. The air is just there because you have to get it there, but it's not coming out the faucet. You know, it's all that plumbing. So where you actually have the respiratory exchange is this respiratory zone. The respiratory zone starts at what is known as a terminal bronchus. So you have the bronchiole, which is really small, and then it terminates into really a dead end, the terminal bronchus, and it is 0.5 millimeters. So it's reduced by another 50% in diameter. And that's the start of the respiratory zone, because right when you get to the terminal bronchus, you begin to have alveoli. You can have the whole alveolar sac, or that cluster of grapes, like this picture shows you. But alveoli actually start, see how there's some just little alveoli starting at that respiratory bronchus, or their terminal bronchus. And that's where there is no muscle, there is no smooth muscle. That's a diffusing space for air exchange. And so it's very thin, it's just simple epithelium, type 1 cells, which are the epithelial cells, type 2 alveolar cells, which are secretion cells to make the fluid secrete surfactant, and then there are macrophages. That's the only 3 cells you have there in that zone, and that makes sense. You don't want a lot in the way. We want to maximize oxygen exchange. And so there in the bronchus, on the way up, you will have circular muscle, and you can have this constriction and dilation. But what this means is, where were we anyway? Lung compliance. I just want to talk about airway resistance, I guess, add this into the whole thing. Then, where am I? I got a little lost. Hold up. I wanted to talk about that anatomy. All right, so where resistance comes into play anatomically is more so in these medium-sized bronchioles. So the larger bronchioles, your air is moving through them pretty well, but as you begin to get to a lot of the bifurcations, there's a lot more turbulence, a lot more resistance, and also you have these circular muscles that can kind of bear down and create a little tone there and create airway resistance. But when you get low enough and there's no more muscles left, really you just get to diffusion and there is no resistance to that airway movement. So you would think that in the tiniest spaces you'd have the most resistance, but it's really in the medium spaces because there are so many of those little bronchioles lined up together that they're almost so parallel that flow can continue in a laminar fashion and reach that endpoint. But it's up a little further where you have more bifurcation that creates more resistance. And that might just be one of those things you sit and meditate on. For all of 30 seconds, you'll have to do that. So the work of breathing, we don't use a ton of energy breathing in healthy lungs, but one of the things we have to overcome every time is this resistance, and it helps if our lung tissue is compliant so that you can create the greatest stretch, even if you're trying to overcome some resistance, because you are, no matter what. More about compliance. Yay, more about compliance. Dependency on the elasticity of the tissues. And so, when does, said healthy lung tissue is very compliant, and we know that, but what happens when it's not so much? And here's a graph, another little graph comparing pressure to volume. There's normal compliance there, that nice stretchy lung tissue. This isn't showing inspiration and expiration like that other graph did. But look when it's reduced. That's reduced lung compliance, so your volume isn't going to change as much, your pressure isn't going to change as much, and the airflow will be reduced. And that makes sense. You don't even have to learn that. You know that. That makes sense. If it's less stretchy, you can't get as much air in. And so what are the things that happen that make lungs less compliant? Things that decrease elasticity, like fibrosis. So a lot of chronic inflammation or these actual interstitial diseases or connective tissue diseases, and you'll get all of that stuff. But they reduce compliance because the material isn't as stretchy and compliant as it once was. And the tissue that's the interstitial tissue, or stroma, not the alveolar cells themselves, that sort of supportive tissue, that really can change. That can become fibrotic or kind of scarred-like, less mobile. Obstruction is another thing that can decrease compliance, because if something's there, one, you can't perfuse beyond it, but the body's natural inflammatory compensations for obstruction will reduce compliance because you'll have a lot of cellular material maybe in those air spaces. Compliance decreases with increased surface tension of alveolar film. So I think that should really be the word increased. So surface tension means a lot of water, basically. Surface that has a high surface tension, and it will tend to draw that alveolus in. And so we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. So the fact that it's able to stay moist and juicy helps it stay open and patent. That goes to compliance. And anything that decreases that ability to stay open and increases the surface tension means more collapse, less compliance. And then the thoracic cage flexibility. So as you get older, all the cartilages kind of tend to calcify a bit, get a little reabsorbed, they're less moist. Everything gets a little, crunchier. And so the muscles can get weaker, and so you can't expand that thoracic cage as much. That decreases compliance. And so some of that's natural with aging. And I would just generally, if one of the things that you can do in all of your patient populations is this is why exercise is so important. Because the more you continue to work that tissue and those muscles and make them strong, the better the compliance is, and the more the lungs can aerate. Man, it just goes to such health, And just even our posture, and I know how it is, you're sitting there. I mean, I know inside you're super excited, but like your body's maybe feeling a little tired. But you're all crunched up. You're just not expanding like you could. That decreases compliance, so posture is really huge on it. We could all just do some warrior poses and just really ventilate, but it's really true, and if that's something we could just get folks as they're aging, they could just breathe well, it will help so much stuff. And so that is just a natural thing that happens, is the decreased ability of the thoracic cage to expand. Lung elasticity is a little bit different than compliance. I mean, they're similar. These are about stretch. And so the compliance is the stretch, and the elasticity is more about the recoil. So that happens. You want to stretch to a smaller thing. But it's important to getting air out. So over-compliant tissue that can never recoil back down isn't going to be able to compress that space, that volume, therefore increasing pressure so that air can go out. So there are some disease states where air tends to track or remain. And so that's a big deal. You have to have enough, you have to have both sides. You know that. You have to have both sides of everything. And so COPD is one of those where you get that barrel chest, they tend to retain a little bit of air. You have a hard time getting it out. You'll hear people, you really will become aware of this when you see people doing stuff and they're pursing their lips trying to get air out, forcibly exhaling it. You know, especially you'll see that in your older, I think your older population. There's a lot of coughing and lip pursing over there at the VA, or it used to be. The generations have changed. Those guys all smoked and had all this COPD and stuff. But that's just trying to get the air out. I think it really makes that point that they've lost that elasticity to some degree. It's part of the whole process that air doesn't leave. So both sides of it. And then here's just a really complicated little picture that I'm not digging at all right now, but when I first put it on there, I loved it. Green light, red light, whatever. Spend some time with that if you like. But I'm going to blow it off. Okay, surface tension. I love surface tension. Do you just kind of like surface tension? I mean, is that something that's ever crossed your mind before? Did you love that in your test tube and you have the just with wine or whatever and how it crawls up the side, or capillary movement, or you'd watch stuff go across the slide and either it was capillary action or something really moving? Did that excite you guys? I know. It is fun, isn't it? Okay. But anyway, surface tension is really, it occurs at a fluid-air interface because you have two different media there. And so one of the big things in life is water. You know that. Water has a lot of, the fact that we use water, I guess, is such a basis for everything. It's very polar. It ionizes very easily. H2O ionizes or falls apart into OH and H, hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions. That naturally happens. What it does is it just creates a lot of polarity, and those molecules tend to really be drawn to each other even more at that interface between air and surface. So you create a tension or bubble there. And you know that about water, naturally, how it does that. And so, the molecules are attracted to each other at the surface, and so it kind of bubbles up. And that's called high surface tension. If you reduce that surface tension, then the water doesn't ball up like that, it spreads out more. So surfactant is the actual thing that helps disrupt that surface tension, thereby decreasing that surface tension. So surfactant is in the alveolar film, or in that moisture, film. Did I just say that word twice? It's the film that's the film. It's the same. Secreted by the type 2 alveolar cells. The type 1 cells are just the epithelial tissues that form the very thin sheet of the actual alveolus itself. The type 2 cells will be in there. They're secretory cells. They're secreting this film. And surfactant, it's a lipoprotein, which makes a lot of sense. When we want to try to interact with water, but also create a barrier, like the cell membrane, lipoproteins are very big there. You know, the phospholipid bilayer has some polarity. It repels water, but it interacts with water. So we like lipids for as oddly as that sounds, since oils don't interact well with water, if we can place a charge on a lipid, it actually will create some boundaries and such. So it's a lipoprotein. It's a protein with lipids attached to its short fatty acid chains. And it just disrupts the cohesiveness of those water molecules. It just gets in there, runs block. And we have it, it's secreted constitutively throughout life, and it starts in utero. And kind of, it's not a switch. I used to think it was like that. Like babies had this switch and surfactant was made and right before birth, and you were able to breathe then because the lung tissue is submerged in amniotic fluid up until that time. That's a catastrophic moment in your life, isn't it? Where none of us have gotten over it. Is that just me? You guys are fine. But going from water to air is, wow. But it really has been building up over time, and if infants are born before that's built up to an appropriate level, then the alveoli will collapse, because you need this disruption to decrease the surface tension and allow this nice full roundness of the alveolus. And that is infant respiratory distress syndrome. So I don't, I'm going to mention diseases here and there, but because it's appropriate to, I think, drive that point home. But you'll learn about the disease and be questioned about diseases in other parts of the course, or concentration. And you have 18 concentrations, by the way, plus a capstone. And this is number 4. You're biting into it. Yeah, you are. You're doing it. Insufficient surfactant neonate. So its incidence decreases with increasing gestational age. So there's just more surfactant the older you cook. So the earlier the babies come out. And so what they do, they have a high heart rate, respiratory rate, and cyanosis, or pure blood, because they're just not ventilating, because the alveoli are collapsed. So there's a surfactant spray, and you can use positive pressure ventilation to try to open those airways until the cells catch up and are able to do their thing. Okay, this is a big deal in pulmonary stuff, with all this spirometry. So it's just a lot of letters and numbers. So let's go. If there's anything, like, it's not as exciting, y'all, as compliance and elasticity. I'm sorry, but it's true. And so I just have these pictures, just, this guy huffing into this spirometer. And anyway, I have a bell over water, and how much you move that bell is measuring millimeters of air moved. And so there are also handheld versions of this, where you don't have a graph necessarily, but you have a digital readout, which is kind of shown up there. There are little handheld ones that are probably, used in family practice or pediatrics, and pulmonologist also, of course. And then there's this other little thing. It's just a little incentive spirometer over here with the blue that's clear. They give it to you post-operatively, or if you're in the hospital for a while. And if you tell people, you don't just say, take some good deep breaths every hour. That's great. Nurses can go in and remind them. But if you give people a little thing and they try to challenge themselves to move that more every day, that really, really works. And so we really should all have this, because you want to win, like, yeah, 50 more milliliters, that's right, But it's also a sign of life and recovery, and that's really, really helpful to people. So if you're working in a hospital, you'll tend to prescribe a lot of incentive spirometers and trying to get people to move air a little bit more. Super important. So anyway, spirometry, the spirometers measure air movement, and here are some of the things they measure. Let me give you a little breaky after this. Unless you don't want to go, then we can just talk about it. Tidal volume, first one, just how much air is moving in and out during eupnea, or quiet breathing. So normal, EU is normal, pretty much. Mia is referring to breathing, so eupnea is normal breathing. Tidal volume, and so you do need to know these numbers, but it's on this picture, so I didn't also write it. So tidal volume, here are the different volume. Tidal volume is just this, and it's about 500 mils that you're moving. Half of a liter of air. Doesn't it feel like more? Well, it is when you're trying harder. So the inspiratory reserve volume, so you see IRV, or inspiratory reserve volume, is if you inhale above what is normal, that's your inspiratory reserve. How much more can you get in there? And that's in the neighborhood of 3,100 mils, and these are all based on healthy young men. Women's numbers, female numbers for all these are always a little bit lower, and that's just true generally. Smaller bodies have lower numbers here, but it's relative to that number, so it's not abnormal. But these are the numbers we give, and it's for healthy male lung volume. If you force air out after tidal expiration, that is the expiratory reserve volume. I don't know why I didn't put ERV there, ERV and IRV, because you'll see them really just reduced letters, Are you doing that yet when you're driving and you look at a sign and you see a license plate that just has 3 letters, you're trying to figure out what they stand for? Increased in pulmonary pressure and all, just, how you're doing that? Like, I remember one day looking at forward and trying to get what is forced, I mean, you know how you, there's so much of it. But when you used to write all this, or you're typing all this, you like it to be fast. So the residual volume, you can't touch that. Oh my goodness, you can't touch this. You can't touch that. That's the air that remains in the lungs that you don't have any control over. So that's the residual volume, and that's about 1,200 mils. Expiratory reserve is about 1,200 mils. So those are the pulmonary volumes. Those are normal pulmonary volumes, and these are the kind of things that you look to see how are they, where are they, are there reduced numbers there and looking for dysfunction. Okay, I want you to take a little breaky break, and I will start again at 11.